It had been 6 months since Daniel signed the divorce papers, but every morning still felt like waking up inside a silent storm. The house was too quiet now. No laughter, no soft hum from the kitchen, no sound of her footsteps moving around the living room. Just him and the echo of what used to be a life. He sat by the window, watching the early morning light spill across the street, trying to remember when sunlight stopped feeling warm. His coffee had gone cold again, untouched. The same cup every day, filled and forgotten. It wasn't that he didn't want to move on. He just didn't know where to start anymore. Sometimes he would scroll through old photos, the vacations, the smiles, the nights they stayed up laughing over nothing. But the more he looked, the more he realized how far away all of that felt now. The woman he loved was gone. Not in body, but in spirit, replaced by silence and legal documents. Friends told him to get out more, meet new people, start fresh. But how do you start fresh when your heart still lives in yesterday? The world didn't stop for his heartbreak. Bills kept coming. Work kept demanding. People kept moving. And somewhere in that endless motion, he began to fade into the background. He used to be confident, focused, the man everyone called dependable. But now, every mirror felt like an enemy, showing a face he didn't recognize anymore. He avoided it. Avoided himself. The hardest part wasn't losing her. It was losing the version of himself that only existed when she was around. One night, when sleep refused to come, Daniel drove aimlessly through the city. Empty streets, glowing signs, rain tapping against the windshield. He pulled over near a quiet park and just sat there, breathing, thinking, existing. For the first time in months, he didn't cry. He just sat still and listened. A thought crossed his mind. Maybe healing wasn't about forgetting her, but about forgiving himself. For what went wrong, for what couldn't be saved, for who he had become after it all. And in that fragile silence, something shifted, a faint spark in the ruins. The next morning, he woke up before dawn. No reason, no plan, just a feeling. He opened his laptop and began to type. Not an email, not work, just words. Thoughts, memories, lessons. The pain poured out like ink from a broken pen. But when he stopped, he realized this was the first thing he had finished in months. It wasn't much, but it was something. And sometimes, something is all you need to begin again. Days slowly began to blend into each other. But this time, they didn't hurt the same way. Daniel had started writing every morning. Not for anyone. Not to publish, just to breathe. Each sentence felt like a small step out of the fog. He didn't know it yet, but the act of writing was rebuilding him piece by piece. He started noticing little things again, the way sunlight painted the walls golden at 7 a.m., how coffee smelled richer when brewed slowly, how quiet could be peaceful instead of painful. Healing didn't announce itself. It came quietly, like dawn. Still, some nights were heavy. Some memories refused to fade. There were moments when he'd still reach for his phone, wanting to text her about something random, a song, a joke, a memory. But he never pressed send. He'd just stare at the screen, smile faintly, and let the moment pass. That was progress too. One Saturday afternoon he went for a walk. It had been months since he'd done something without purpose. The air was cool, the park alive with laughter and chatter. He sat on a bench watching strangers live their lives, couples holding hands, kids chasing pigeons, an old man feeding squirrels. For a moment, Daniel realized how life never stopped. It just changed form. A small girl, maybe 6 or 7, ran past him, tripped and fell. Before he could think, he got up and helped her stand. She smiled, said thank you, and ran back to her parents. He watched her go, and for the first time he smiled too, a real one. It felt strange and beautiful at the same time. That night he wrote again. But this time it wasn't about loss. It was about gratitude. Gratitude for surviving, for the strength that had quietly grown inside him while he wasn't looking. He wrote about learning to breathe again, to find peace in solitude. And as the words flowed, he realized something. He wasn't healing from the past. He was healing through it. He printed that piece and pinned it to his wall. The paper fluttered softly every time the fan turned, a reminder that even fragile things can move with the wind. The next morning he made a decision. It was time to rebuild, not just emotionally but physically, to start living again. He signed up for a local gym, dusted off his old sneakers, and went for his first jog in years. His lungs burned. His legs ached, but deep down, something in him felt alive again. When he got home, sweaty and exhausted, he looked in the mirror. For the first time, he didn't look away. The man staring back wasn't broken. He was becoming someone new. He began waking up early again, not because he had to, but because he wanted to. The quiet of morning no longer felt lonely. It felt sacred. Daniel brewed his coffee, opened the window, and let the sunlight touch his face. It was strange how something as simple as light could remind him that he was still here, still breathing, still capable of starting again. One day, while jogging through the park, he met Sarah. She was sitting under a tree sketching, her headphones in, completely lost in her world. When a stray ball rolled toward her, Daniel ran to grab it before it hit her sketchbook. She looked up, smiled, and thanked him. It wasn't love at first sight. It was something softer, calmer. A quiet recognition that both of them were healing from something. Over the next few weeks, they began to talk. Not about pain or heartbreak, but about books, music, and dreams they'd forgotten. Sarah was an artist who had once given up painting after her own divorce. Daniel understood that silence, the silence of someone who had loved deeply and lost completely. They started meeting often, sometimes for coffee, sometimes for walks, sometimes just to sit together without saying much. There was no rush, no pressure, no expectation. And that's what made it real. Two people who had once been broken were slowly helping each other remember what warmth felt like. One evening, as the city lights flickered on, Sarah told him, "You know, I thought my story ended when he left." Daniel smiled gently and said, "Maybe it just changed chapters." That night he went home and wrote those words down. It just changed chapters. He didn't realize it then, but that sentence would become the title of his first blog post. He started sharing his writings online, stories of resilience, love, and second chances. At first no one noticed. Then one post went viral, a simple story about learning to rebuild after loss. Thousands of people began commenting, sharing their own experiences. His inbox filled with messages from strangers saying, "Your words helped me. I felt this. Thank you." And that's when Daniel understood. Sometimes pain isn't meant to destroy you. It's meant to teach you how to heal others. Weeks turned into months. His life didn't suddenly become perfect, but it became real. He still missed his old life sometimes, but now he missed it without bitterness. Sarah and he continued to grow, not as replacements for what was lost, but as reminders that love can exist again, quietly, patiently, after the storm. One Sunday morning, he sat at his desk with his coffee, opened his laptop, and began typing his next post. Life after divorce, the beauty of becoming someone new. The first few weeks at his new job felt like stepping into another world. The office buzzed with energy, people moving fast, screens lighting up with numbers, and a constant murmur of ambition in the air. Ethan often sat quietly at his desk, surrounded by younger faces that seemed far more confident than he felt. He didn't belong here, not yet, but he wanted to. He had joined a mid-level position at a marketing firm, one that had taken a chance on him despite the gap in his resume. Every morning, as he adjusted his tie and looked at his reflection, he whispered to himself, "You've survived worse. You can survive this too." At first, the noise, the pace, and the pressure scared him. Deadlines came fast, expectations were higher than he'd imagined, and some days he left feeling invisible. But he kept showing up. He stayed late, asked questions, learned new software, and slowly began to understand how this world worked. Then something started to change. His small ideas began to catch attention. A few of his marketing strategies got noticed by the higher-ups. His colleagues, who once barely acknowledged him, started seeking his input. For the first time in years, he felt like he mattered again. At home, his small apartment didn't feel so empty anymore. He had filled one wall with his kids, old photos, and another with sticky notes of his goals. Each note carried a word: patience, focus, consistency. These weren't just reminders. They were his silent promises to himself. Every evening after work, he would make coffee, sit by the window, and write in his journal. He didn't write about pain anymore. He wrote about progress, even the tiniest ones. "Didn't panic today," one line said. "Smiled back at life," said another. Days turned into months, and with each passing week, Ethan began to rebuild not just his career, but his confidence brick by brick. The man who once thought his story had ended had just started a new chapter, quietly, steadily, and with a strength he never knew he had. Days turned into weeks, and David kept painting, sometimes through tears, sometimes through silence. His small apartment, once cold and lifeless, now glowed with colors of emotion. Canvases leaned against the walls, each one whispering a story of heartbreak, endurance, and quiet hope. The smell of acrylic and turpentine filled the air like a strange comfort. Every morning, David would sit by the window, a cup of black coffee in his trembling hands, watching sunlight crawl across his floor. The city outside moved fast, people rushing to jobs, chasing deadlines, but his world had slowed down. Inside that slowness, something new was being born. He painted memories, the look in his ex-wife's eyes the day she left, the empty chair at their kitchen table, the photograph that once hung above their bed. But with each brushstroke, the pain turned softer. The colors changed, from grays and blues to deep oranges and bright golds. His sadness was transforming into something beautiful. One night, while scrolling on his old laptop, David saw a post, local art fair, submissions open. For a long minute, he just stared at the screen. A part of him whispered, "You're too old for this." Another voice, quieter but stronger, said, "Try." He hesitated for days. Then one evening he wrapped 3 of his favorite paintings, not perfect, but real, and sent them in. When the acceptance email arrived, he sat still for almost an hour, unable to believe it. The day of the fair came. The hall buzzed with chatter and laughter. Young artists were setting up, confident and bright, their friends filming every moment. David stood quietly in one corner, wearing a simple gray shirt, heart pounding like a drum. He hung his paintings and stepped back. At first no one stopped. Minutes passed like hours. Doubt began to whisper again. Then a middle-aged woman paused in front of his painting. "Sunlight after rain." She stared for a long time, her eyes glistening. Then she turned to him and said softly, "Your art, it feels like healing." David couldn't speak. He just nodded, tears blurring his vision. By the end of the day, 2 of his 3 paintings had sold. But more than that, people were feeling something. They were connecting with his pain, his rebirth, his truth. That night, David walked home through the quiet streets with his empty canvas bag, but his heart was fuller than ever before. For the first time in years, he didn't feel like a man who'd been left behind. He felt like a man who was finally coming home to himself. Weeks passed after the art fair, but the echo of that woman's words stayed in David's mind. "Your art feels like healing." It became a quiet fire inside him, something that kept him going even on the loneliest mornings. He started waking up before sunrise, not out of habit, but out of hunger, a hunger to create, to rebuild, to feel alive again. His small apartment had turned into a living studio. There were paint stains on the floor, brushes in every coffee mug, and unfinished canvases resting against every wall. The mess no longer bothered him. It was proof that he was still moving, still growing. One rainy afternoon, David received a message from a woman named Laura, the organizer of the art fair. "I can't stop thinking about your work," she wrote. "Would you like to display in our upcoming gallery event next month?" David froze. He read the message twice, 3 times. He hadn't expected this. Not at his age, not after everything he'd lost. His first instinct was fear. What if I'm not good enough? What if they realize I'm just a beginner? But then he looked around, at the colors, the light, the quiet life he'd built out of ashes, and whispered to himself, "Why not me?" The weeks leading up to the gallery were chaos. He barely slept, painting late into the night, experimenting with new shades, new ideas, new emotions. His art had become more than pictures. It was his soul stitched back together in color. The night of the exhibition, David stood in the center of the white-walled gallery, surrounded by his own creations. People moved slowly through the room, whispering, pointing, feeling. Journalists asked him about his style and message. He didn't know how to answer them. He had no artistic theory, no training, just truth. When one young man asked, "What inspired this piece?" David smiled softly and said, "Losing everything, and realizing that was the best thing that ever happened to me." The crowd went silent for a moment. Then applause broke out. Cameras clicked. Someone from a local magazine asked to interview him. Someone else wanted to buy 3 of his paintings for their office. As he stood there under the gallery lights, David thought about the night his wife had walked away, about how broken he'd been, how small his world had felt. And now, standing among people who saw beauty in his pain, he realized something powerful. His story wasn't about loss anymore. It was about rebirth. Later that night, when the crowd had gone and the lights dimmed, Laura walked up to him with 2 cups of coffee. "You did something incredible tonight," she said. David smiled tiredly. I just painted what was true. She looked at him for a long moment and said softly, "Maybe that's what makes it so powerful." They talked until the staff started locking the doors. She laughed at his dry humor. He listened to her stories about chasing dreams. And for the first time in years, David felt a warmth that wasn't loneliness. It wasn't romance, not yet, but something even more precious, connection. As he walked home through the quiet city, the rain had stopped. Streetlights glowed in puddles, reflecting the soft shimmer of a world washed clean. David looked up at the night sky and whispered, "This is my second sunrise." That night, everything felt heavier than before. The silence of the office was broken only by the faint hum of the lights and the ticking of the wall clock. I tried focusing on my work, but my eyes kept wandering toward the hallway, the same hallway, where I had seen that flicker last night. I told myself it was nothing, maybe a loose wire, maybe just my imagination, but deep down, I wasn't so sure anymore. Suddenly, a faint whisper echoed near the photocopy machine. I froze. It wasn't clear, just a low murmur like someone calling from far away. My heart started racing, and I slowly turned my head in that direction. The machine's light flickered for a moment and then went off. I stood up, clutching my phone like a weapon, and whispered, "Who's there?" No answer, just silence again. I walked slowly toward the copier, every step feeling heavier than the last. When I reached it, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. A paper had just come out of the machine, but I hadn't pressed print. I picked it up with trembling hands. On it, there was only one line typed, "Don't stay here after midnight." My heart sank. I looked at the time, 12:03 a.m. Months turned into a year, and Owais was no longer the man who once stared blankly at his phone, scrolling through old pictures. He had started a small design studio from home, just him, a laptop, and a dream. Every day, he woke up before sunrise, prayed, and wrote 3 things he was grateful for. It wasn't easy at first, but that little act healed something deep inside him. One afternoon, while sipping coffee at his favorite cafe, he met Sarah, a woman who had gone through her own storms. She wasn't perfect, but she was real. They didn't fall in love instantly. Instead, they talked, shared stories, and understood each other's scars. For the first time in years, Owais laughed without forcing it. But what made this phase of his life truly beautiful wasn't Sarah, or the growing business. It was the quiet confidence he had built within himself. He had stopped looking for validation. He no longer needed to prove his worth. One evening, as the sun set over the city skyline, Owais whispered to himself, "Maybe life doesn't end after heartbreak. Maybe it just begins again, softer, wiser, and more peaceful." Weeks later, Owais stood in front of a small audience at a local entrepreneurship event. It was his first public talk, something he'd never imagined doing. His hands trembled at first, but as he began sharing his journey, the pain, the fall, the healing, a calm settled over him. People listened, not to a man who was broken, but to one who had rebuilt himself piece by piece. After the event, a young man approached him and said, "Your story gave me hope. I just went through a divorce too, and I thought my life was over." Owais smiled and placed a hand on his shoulder. "It's never over, brother. Sometimes God removes people to make space for our real self to grow." That night, Owais looked out from his balcony, the cool wind brushing against his face. The city lights shimmered like tiny stars. And for the first time in a long while, he felt free, truly free. No anger, no regret, just gratitude. He realized that every wound had been a teacher, every loss a lesson. Life wasn't about avoiding pain. It was about learning to dance with it. As he closed his eyes, he whispered, "This is not my second chance. This is my real beginning." Months turned into a year, and Owais's life looked nothing like before. His small design startup had grown into a full-fledged business. He had a small but loyal team, people who believed in his vision, not his past. His apartment, once silent and heavy with memories, now echoed with laughter, friends, and soft background music. One evening, while watching the sunset from his balcony, he received a message from his ex-wife. It wasn't an apology, just a simple, "I'm glad you're doing well." He smiled softly. There was no bitterness left, no old flame to reignite. "Just peace," he typed back. "I truly wish you happiness too." And he meant it. As the orange sky faded into twilight, he whispered to himself, "Sometimes we lose everything just to find ourselves again." He finally understood. The end of his marriage wasn't the end of his story. It was the start of the chapter where he became the person he was always meant to be. And as night fell, Owais stood by the window, feeling the quiet joy of a man who had survived the storm and learned how to shine in its aftermath.